The hook Kizaru's retreat. There's a scene in One Piece that, if you really stop and think about it, shouldn't have gone the way it did. A Marine admiral, trained his whole life to face the most dangerous monsters of the seas, looks at an ordinary man, no devil fruit, no flashy title, and simply backs off. He doesn't trade a single blow. He doesn't try to negotiate. He retreats. And that man isn't Shanks. That man is Benn Beckman. And that's exactly what I want to show you today, why Benn Beckman might be, on his own, capable of standing toe-to-toe with a Yonko-level commander, and maybe even a Yonko himself. If that sounds interesting to you, stick around until the end, because what I'm about to show you is going to completely change the way you look at this character. The Yonko commander pattern. Why most commanders stay below their captain. First of all, we need to understand something the world of One Piece makes pretty clear. Raw power alone isn't what defines the top of the pirate hierarchy. There are devil fruit users who can destroy entire islands, swordsmen who can cut through mountains, men who breathe fire and ice like it's nothing. And yet, in the middle of all that chaos of absurd powers, a man with no fruit, no flashy fighting style, is treated by the story as something apart from all of that. That's the first mystery of Beckman. He breaks the logic that only flashy, visually spectacular power can be feared. Let's go back in time. Beckman has been around since the very first chapter of the manga, back when Luffy was still a kid playing around in Fuchsia Village. That alone says a lot, because Oda rarely wastes space at the very beginning of his story. He could have put any random pirate next to Shanks in that iconic tavern scene, but he chose Beckman. That kind of narrative choice usually signals that the character is going to matter later on, even if the reader doesn't realize it right away. And here's the point most people never really stop to analyze throughout the entire series. Beckman is never treated as just another strong crew member. He is repeatedly treated as a direct extension of Shanks' own authority. That's different from every other Yonko commander we know. Think about the other right-hand men we've seen. Marco the Phoenix, 1st Division commander of Whitebeard's crew, has absurd regeneration and healing powers through his blue flames. Even so, throughout the entire Battle of Marineford, he's never placed on the same level as Whitebeard himself. There's a clear gap in power between them, even though Marco is, without a doubt, one of the strongest characters in the series. The same goes for Katakuri, even though he's described as the strongest of Big Mom's suite commanders, with an observation haki so advanced it lets him see seconds into the future. He still doesn't come close to the level of destruction Big Mom herself represents. And King, Kato's strongest commander, with his mysterious Lunarian origin and his body of blue flame, is also clearly below Kato in raw power. That pattern repeats itself crew after crew. The commander is monstrous, sure, but the captain is in a different category altogether. It's almost an unwritten rule within the story. How Shanks' crew breaks the rulean, that's exactly where Shanks' crew breaks the pattern. Unlike other Yonko crews, which tend to be built around a massive army of subordinates, the Red Hair Pirates follow a completely different philosophy, extreme quality over quantity. In the chapter where Oda officially introduces the crew's main names, it's revealed that figures like Beckman, Lucky Roo, and Yasop were already known worldwide, with extremely high bounties before they even joined Shanks. That means the entire crew was built on a foundation of monsters, not numbers. And within that select group, Beckman isn't just one more monster. He's officially described, in Oda's own canonical material, as someone comparable in strength to Shanks himself. Stop and let that sink in for a second. We're talking about the man who stopped an entire war at Marineford with his presence alone, who made an admiral back off at a distance just from the weight of his haki, who is treated by the story as one of the 4 most powerful living names in the seas. And official material places Beckman on a level comparable to that same man. That changes everything. Because if Beckman is genuinely comparable to Shanks, he can't be measured with the same ruler we use for other commanders. He has to be measured with the ruler we use for the Yonko themselves, and there's only one other case in One Piece history where a commander gets treated this way: Galdi, Roger's crew. Silver's Rayleigh was never presented as just another subordinate of the Pirate King, even decades later. Already an old man, he's able to fight Kizaru alone at Sabaody without showing any clear sign of being outmatched. That proves that when Oda wants to establish that a vice captain is genuinely close to his captain's level, he builds this exact kind of scene, where that vice captain holds his own against an admiral solo. And that's precisely what happens with Beckman at Marineford. Breaking down the Marineford scene, Kizaru, light speed, and observation hockey. Let's get to that scene now, because it's the key to everything during the Battle of Marineford. When the Red Hair Pirates finally arrived to put an end to the conflict, Kizaru, who just minutes earlier had traded direct blows with Marco, Whitebeard's strongest commander, comes face to face with Beckman. And what does he do? He raises his hands. He backs off. He doesn't try to attack, doesn't try to test the waters. He just recognizes, right there on the spot, that the risk wasn't worth taking. Here's a detail most analyzers out there completely ignore. Kizaru has the power of light. He literally moves at the speed of light. By pure logic of speed alone, he should be able to escape from absolutely any physical attack, including a gunshot. So why does he simply give up on any confrontation at all? The most coherent answer comes down to observation hockey. We already know, from later feats in the story, that Shanks has such an advanced mastery of observation hockey that he's somehow able to neutralize other users' ability to see the future, to the point that some fans and theorists call him the observation hockey killer. If that trait is somehow shared with, or complemented by Beckman's extreme closeness to Shanks, that would perfectly explain how he managed to get within range of an admiral without being detected in time, and why even light speed wasn't enough to escape an attack that had already been seen before it happened. There's another detail few people stop to consider: the caliber of Beckman's weapon. He doesn't carry just any handgun. His rifle is large, heavy, the kind typically used to take down large game from long distances. If that rifle is firing rounds coated in advanced armament hockey, the kind that hits the target from the inside, completely bypassing physical defenses and even the natural durability of Logia-type users, then we're talking about a projectile that could seriously injure anyone, admiral or not. And this theory isn't just loose speculation. There's direct confirmation from the official booklet for the Red movie, which details Beckman's abilities. He's able to coat his shots with hockey, making them lethal even against Logia-type fruit users, who would normally let ordinary bullets pass right through them with no effect at all. That alone puts him at an extremely rare level of tactical usefulness, because it turns a rifle, theoretically a weak weapon by One Piece power standards, into something capable of wounding any enemy, regardless of what kind of power they have. Beckman's intelligence, the highest IQ of the East Blue Saga. Now let's move on to another pillar of this discussion, Beckman's intelligence. In Volume 8 of the manga, in a reader Q&A section, Oda reveals something a lot of people forget. Benn Beckman has the highest IQ among all the characters introduced during the East Blue Saga. And to understand the weight of that, remember who else shows up during that same stretch of the story: Nami, recognized by the whole crew as a natural-born strategist; Kuro, capable of planning a silent scheme for years without ever being caught; and even Monkey D. Dragon, who already carried an aura of mystery and intelligence from his very first appearance. Even surrounded by those names, Oda chose to put Beckman on top. That suggests something important. Beckman's role in the crew isn't just the second strongest guy. He probably functions as the strategic brain behind the Red Hair Pirates' decisions, the one who reads the battlefield, anticipates movement, and turns Shanks' decisions into concrete, successful actions. And maybe the clearest example of that intelligence shows up, almost hidden, in the official novel about Portgas D. Ace's journey before he became famous. In that story, Beckman makes a direct comment to Ace. He tells him that Ace didn't have the profile of a pirate, that he'd fit much better as a revolutionary, and that if he kept following the path he was on, it would eventually cost him his life. Years later, that's exactly what happened. Ace dies at Marineford as a direct consequence of the choices he made by walking the pirate path. Beckman predicted that outcome with startling clarity, long before any event would have justified that conclusion for anyone else. That's not luck. That's reading someone's character on an almost supernatural level. Now put those two pieces together: a man with enough intelligence to predict other people's fate years in advance, and enough strength to make an admiral back off without a single blow exchanged. What does that tell you about this character's real capability to face, alone, an average Yonko-level commander? Comparing Beckman to other Yonko commanders and the Kid confrontation, let's compare directly. Pick any Yonko commander you want: Marco, Katakuri, King, Queen, Jack, and think about what's usually needed to beat them, or at least fight them to a draw: extremely developed fruit powers. years of brutal physical training, and usually some kind of specific terrain or strategic advantage. As far as the story shows, Beckman doesn't use any devil fruit at all. He relies entirely on hockey refined to an extreme degree and a level of combat precision that's almost impossible to replicate. And yet, in official records, he's treated as equivalent in strength to one of the 4 most feared names in the seas. Honestly, that's more impressive than having a powerful fruit, because it means Beckman's level doesn't come from some natural advantage or mystical power. It comes purely from skill, discipline, and extremely honed hockey. And historically in One Piece, that kind of strength tends to be even more feared, precisely because it has no obvious ceiling. Devil fruits have known limitations. Hockey refined to the extreme, combined with decades of real combat experience, is a far more unpredictable equation. This brings up another connecting point, the concept of the hockey of the conquering king. This extremely rare type of hockey usually shows up in characters who are on a level far above average, even among the strong. Shanks has this hockey, and since Beckman is described in official material as comparable to him in strength, there's a real possibility that Beckman also carries this rare trait, even if the story hasn't shown it explicitly in combat yet. The official material on the character even states that his very existence is feared by even the most powerful warriors of the New World. That's not a description you give to someone who's just good at fighting. It's a description reserved for someone who represents a real threat. Even to people who are already extremely strong, there's another event that tends to slip under the radar, the indirect clash between Beckman and Eustace Kid. It was Beckman, not Shanks, who tore off Kid's arm. And the most impressive part isn't the act itself, but the coldness with which Beckman handled it afterward. He made it clear that if Kid tried anything again, next time he wouldn't just lose an arm. No shouting, no exaggerated show of power, just a direct threat delivered with the calm of someone who knows exactly what they're capable of doing. And Kid isn't just anybody. He invaded Big Mom's territory, wounded one of her sweet commanders, stole a copy of a poneglyph, and later, alongside Law, managed to take down Big Mom herself. We're talking about one of the names who helped bring down a Yonko. And even so, the only direct confrontation that left a permanent mark on him, even before Shanks ever showed up, was against Beckman. Putting it all together, you get a pretty clear picture. Beckman has enough intelligence to predict other people's futures with surgical precision, enough strength to make an admiral back off solo, and enough combat ability to leave a permanent mark on one of the most dangerous pirates of the newer generation. That's not the profile of a useful right-hand man, that's the profile of someone who can, on his own, hold his ground against a Yonko commander as an equal, and maybe even pose a real challenge to a Yonko himself, depending on the circumstances of the fight. And maybe the most interesting part of all this is how Beckman handles his own power. He never seeks recognition. He never centers a flashy action scene just to show off strength. He acts only when strictly necessary, and when he acts, the result is final, leaving no room for doubt or further conflict. While Shanks represents the presence everyone recognizes from a distance, the name that stops wars just by existing, Beckman represents the silent foundation that holds that presence up, without ever needing to compete for the spotlight. Now think about where the story stands right now. We're entering One Piece's final saga, with the red hair pirates getting closer and closer to the center of the main events. Shanks has already shown willingness to get actively involved in the conflict, especially after recent events involving the world government and the latest movements around the One Piece itself. If that happens, it's almost certain Beckman will be right there beside him, and this time, possibly in a direct fight that finally shows, in practice, everything that until now has only been suggested through indirect feats and official descriptions. And if that moment comes, I wouldn't be surprised if Beckman, on his own, becomes one of the most respected characters in the final stretch of the story, precisely because he never had to prove anything before that. Because that's the essence of Benn Beckman, the man who can face a Yonko as an equal, with no devil fruit, no grand speech, just absurd intelligence, hockey refined to the extreme, and a calmness that by itself is enough to make the world's most dangerous opponents think twice before acting. Yoda never shows him fight the two narrative languages, but before getting to the conclusion, I want to open up an important parenthesis. because there's a question that always pops up in the comments whenever this topic comes up. If Beckman is really this strong, why doesn't Oda just show it more explicitly? Why has he never starred in a long fight full of exchanged blows the way we've seen with Zoro, with Luffy, with practically every other character the story wants to highlight? I believe this question actually carries its own answer inside it. Oda uses two different narrative languages to build power within One Piece. The first is the language of explicit combat, blows, named techniques, power growth shown scene by scene. That's the language he uses for protagonists, because the reader needs to follow their growth visually and gradually. The second language is that of functional mystery, characters the story treats as dangerous precisely because they never need to prove anything. Mihawk worked that way for a long time. So did Rayleigh. And Beckman is, so far, the most extreme example of that second category. When Oda chooses not to show a fight, he's usually making a deliberate choice to build tension through absence. Think about how many times the story has used this device. Mihawk never actually fought anyone from the main crew before the time skip. And yet he was treated as the strongest swordsman in the world purely through how other characters reacted to his presence. Beckman gets exactly the same treatment. Kizaru's reaction at Marineford isn't just an action scene. It's a silent declaration of the threat level that character represents. Without needing to spend a single full page showing an actual fight, this kind of narrative construction, by the way, tends to be used specifically for characters Oda plans to reveal further down the line. It doesn't make sense to build this much mystery around someone who's never going to pay it off with a scene that lives up to it. So, in my view, the absence of explicit fights from Beckman isn't a sign of narrative weakness. It's the opposite. The story is saving ammunition for a moment that's still coming, probably within the final saga. Beckman's role within the crew, the strategic bodyguard. Now let me bring up another angle to this discussion, one that has directly to do with how Beckman positions himself within Shanks' own crew. If you pay attention to practically every scene where Beckman appears, there's a visual pattern that repeats itself. He's always a little behind Shanks, never in front, never at the center of the frame. That could be read, on the surface, as a sign of submission, like he's just a subordinate following orders. But I think that reading misses the point. That positioning is actually typical of someone playing the role of strategic bodyguard. Someone who's there not to compete for the spotlight, but to cover the angles the captain isn't looking at. That kind of role exists in practically every major organization in One Piece, but Oda rarely gives it as much weight as he does in Beckman's case. Think about how many times we've seen Beckman watching the surroundings while Shanks talks, drinks, or simply commands presence. He's always processing information, always assessing threats, even when the scene looks calm. That lines up with the title Oda himself gave him in the official databook: someone calm, composed, sharp, and gifted with exceptional intelligence. That's not the description of a fighter. It's the description of a strategist who also happens to fight, and fight extremely well. And that brings me to another point I find fascinating: the relationship between Beckman and the concept of the perfect commander within the story. In almost every Yonko crew, there's a natural tension between the strongest commander and the captain, because the commander, on some level, always represents a latent threat to the captain's authority, even if they never actually rebel. That's why so many crews have complex hierarchies, internal rivalries, subtle power struggles. But with Shanks and Beckman, that kind of tension simply doesn't exist. The story never suggests, not even for a second, that Beckman wants to take Shanks' place or compete for leadership of the crew. That's rare. And I believe that lack of personal ambition is, paradoxically, one of the reasons Beckman can be so powerful without ever needing to show it. He has no reason to prove anything to anyone, because he's already exactly where he wants to be. Within the logic of hockey itself in One Piece, that kind of inner stillness is usually associated with characters who have extremely high emotional mastery. And emotional mastery, according to the story, is one of the fundamental pillars for developing advanced hockey. The hypothetical fight Beckman vs. a mid-tier Yonko commander lets add one more piece to this puzzle: Beckman's track record in high-risk situations across the story's timeline. Beyond the indirect clash with Kid and the scene at Marineford, there's another moment that tends to get overlooked in discussions about the character: the way he reacts during the incident that resulted in Luffy losing his arm as a child back at Fuchsia Village. In that moment, Beckman doesn't need to do anything beyond watching the situation unfold, and even so, The way he follows the events already shows a level of situational reading far above average for a side character at that early stage of the story. This kind of detail, when placed alongside everything we've covered so far, reinforces the idea that Oda has always treated Beckman as a special piece on the board, even in the oldest chapters of the manga. Long before any reader could have imagined this character would carry so much structural weight in building the myth around Shanks and the Red Hair Pirates. Now, I want to propose a quick thought experiment. Imagine a hypothetical, purely speculative scenario where Beckman had to face, alone, a mid-tier Yonko commander, let's say, someone on King's or Katakuri's level. What would happen? First, he'd enter that fight with an advantage few opponents can neutralize, movement reading through advanced observation haki, possibly complemented by that same Shanks' ability to interfere with an opponent's perception. That alone would already cancel out a big chunk of the advantage speed-based or prediction-based commanders usually have. Second, he'd bring a ranged combat arsenal coated in advanced armament haki, capable of wounding both Logia users and any kind of conventional physical defense, which would drastically reduce any advantage the opponent had based on durability or regeneration, like Marco, for example. And third, and maybe most important, he'd enter that fight with decades of real combat experience alongside one of the four most powerful living men, which means constant exposure to extremely high-pressure situations against Yonko level or near Yonko level opponents across practically his entire adult life. That's a kind of experience very few characters in the story possess, and one that usually only shows up in extremely respected veterans. Like Rayleigh himself, add up those three advantages, and you get a combat profile that's extremely hard to neutralize, even against someone officially classified as a Yonko commander. I'm not saying he'd easily beat any of them, since the story has never made that explicit, but I am saying the power gap between Beckman and those commanders is probably much smaller than most fans imagine, and might not even exist, depending on the specific opponent. And coming back to the main point of this analysis, if we directly compare how the story treats Beckman versus how it treats other Yonko right-hand men, it becomes harder and harder to support the idea that he's just another strong commander. He's consistently treated, across more than 2 decades of publication, as a figure apart, someone who occupies a narrative space reserved only for characters who are genuinely close to the highest level of the power hierarchy in the world of One Piece. And it's exactly that consistency that makes this theory so solid. It's not an isolated interpretation based on a single scene taken out of context. It's a pattern that repeats itself, chapter after chapter, official material after official material, from the very first chapter of the manga to the most recent events involving the Red Hair Pirates movements in the main plot. How the world government perceives the threat political balance of the new world. There's one last piece of information I saved for the end, because I think it sums up better than any other argument why Beckman occupies such a special place within the story. Let's talk about the scale of threat perceived by the world government itself. In One Piece, the clearest way to measure how dangerous a pirate is considered, aside from the bounty itself, is to watch how the Marines and the government react to the mere mention of their name. And when we look at the records scattered throughout the story about the Red Hair Pirates, it's clear Beckman's name is never treated as secondary. On more than one occasion, high-ranking Marine officers show visible discomfort just from knowing he's present in a given region. Even before any confrontation happens, that kind of preemptive reaction is extremely rare in the story, and is usually reserved only for names that circulate at the absolute top of the power hierarchy, the Yonko themselves, the admirals, the oldest members of the now-defunct cipher Paul Aegis Zero, and a handful of other legendary names like Rayleigh, Garp, and Mihawk. Beckman making it onto this list of people who put the entire system on alert just by existing is, by itself, an extremely strong indirect confirmation of everything we've discussed so far. There's another interesting detail connecting all of this to the political structure of the New World. We know the 4 great Yonko crews function, in practice, as powers maintaining a balance with the world government itself, a kind of maritime Cold War. No Yonko attacks the government directly and constantly, and the government, in turn, avoids provoking outright conflict with any of them, precisely because the cost of an all-out war would be too high for both sides. Within that logic, it makes sense for each Yonko to have, by their side, at least one figure capable of serving as a second line of deterrence. Someone who reinforces that sense of balance even when the Yonko isn't personally present. For Kato, that figure was King. For Big Mom, for a long time, it was Katakuri. And for Shanks, without a doubt, that figure is Beckman. The difference is that, while King and Katakuri clearly operated 1 or 2 levels below their respective captains, Beckman seems to operate much closer to Shanks's level than any other commander has ever come to operating relative to their Yonko. And it's exactly that closeness in level that makes Shanks's crew so particularly intimidating, even though, in raw member count, it's one of the smallest among the 4 great crews. Why he never shows up in official power rankings? No, I know that at some point in this analysis, someone's going to think, but if Beckman is really this strong, why does he never show up in official power rankings published by the publisher itself, the way Marco or Katakuri do? And that's a fair observation, but it has a pretty simple explanation once you look closely at how that kind of material is actually produced. Official power rankings are, most of the time, built based on visible feats within the story itself, fights that have already happened on the page with clear outcomes. Beckman, deliberately, has never taken part in that kind of fight. He's never had a sequence of panels showing him exchanging direct blows with another heavyweight character from start to finish with a clear win or lose outcome. That makes it extremely hard for any official material to place him numerically in a ranking, simply because there's no concrete visual reference to base that placement on, but that doesn't diminish the weight of the information we already have at all. If anything, I'd say it actually reinforces the argument, because it means everything we know about Beckman's strength level comes from extremely reliable sources, direct statements from Oda himself in official material, reactions from other extremely powerful characters within the story itself, and a consistent pattern of behavior across decades of publication. When you stack up that kind of indirect evidence, it becomes, in practice, just as strong as any explicit fight could have been, and that's exactly why I'm convinced, with quite a bit of confidence, that Benn Beckman isn't just a strong commander within the Yonko hierarchy. He's most likely the only commander in the entire history of this series with real conditions to face a Yonko as an equal, without needing outside advantages, traps, or exceptional circumstances. And the reason he's never had to prove this explicitly isn't because the story forgot about him. It's because Oda is deliberately saving this moment for when it really matters within the main narrative, probably at some crucial point still coming in the final saga. WHAT this means for the final saga. Let's wrap up this analysis with a reflection on what all of this means for the future of the story, with the final saga moving forward, and with the world government increasingly pressured by recent events involving the ancient weapons and the growing alliance forming around Luffy. It's almost inevitable that Shanks, and by extension his entire crew, will be forced to get more actively involved in the final conflict over the One Piece. And if that happens, Beckman is unlikely to keep occupying just a quiet support role in the background. I'd bet that, when that moment comes, we'll finally see Beckman in a real fight, against an opponent heavy enough to justify decades of narrative build-up around him. And if the theories we've discussed here hold up, that fight will probably surprise even the most experienced fans of the series, because it'll reveal that the most underrated commander among the Yonko's right-hand men was, in fact, always among the strongest in the entire history of One Piece, and that's exactly why I believe, with quite a bit of conviction, that Benn Beckman is, right now, the only commander in the entire history of the series with real, even if indirect, proven conditions to face a Yonko as an equal. Not by luck, not by circumstance, but because every single piece of information Oda has given us, across more than 2 decades of publication, consistently points in that same direction. If you enjoyed this analysis and want to understand even more about the hidden mysteries inside One Piece, drop a like on this video because it really helps the channel grow. And go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next videos on theories and fun facts from the series. And if you want to keep going down this rabbit hole, I've got another video showing up on screen right now that you're going to enjoy a lot. Thanks so much for sticking with me all the way to the end, and see you in the next one.